Short bumper. All right. Real short, huh, band? Yeah. All right. Hello. My name is David, one of the pastors here. That's me. Hey, Jonathan. Yeah, so a couple things. This is what they call a turbulent takeoff. So some of you might have been here about a month and a half ago or less. I don't remember exactly when it was. We kicked off this series a month and a half ago, and then we stopped doing this series, and we did a completely different series in the interim period, and now we're picking up this series again. If that sounds confusing, join the club. But what this is has been a project that I've been trying to figure out what does it look like here for some time, because and please do not take this in any sort of negative connotation. I'm just not confident that we could, for all the reasons Matt alluded to a moment ago, pull off a sequential, like verse by verse, chapter by chapter walk through a book of the Bible here. So in order to do that, I've decided to spread it out over the course of an entire year with generous breaks in between. So that we'll do a week or two of this, and then we'll talk about something else, which is equally, if not more meaningful, and then we'll circle back to it. And the plan is, and forgive me, I didn't actually check beforehand, but the plan is by the next time we're doing this, so another 4 to 6 weeks from now, there will be a playlist or like a page on our YouTube channel where all of the talks in this particular series are like gathered. So if you miss one, you can go check it out, which I'm sure you all will do. But just by way of recap for those of you who may have missed it a month or so ago when we kicked this off. So what this is, we're not going to go verse by verse, although today we're literally only going to talk about one verse, but a section by section, chapter by chapter exploration specifically of the book of Mark, but not just the book of Mark in general. You're not only going to get my opinions, as much as I know that you crave those, but specifically you're going to get the opinions of a guy named Theodore Jennings, who was a theologian, scholar, pastor, author, who did most of his work, at least academically, at the Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, but also did a lot of work internationally. He spent a lot of time in Mexico, a lot of time in Southeast Asia doing work there. He was a queer theologian. If you want to know more about his story, my friend Shay Watts and I spent some time together at the Sunday I keep referencing about a month ago. So you can go find that on our YouTube channel, but you learn all about why we think his opinions on the book of Mark are so meaningful and important and relevant. And so you're going to be getting sort of my distillation of those in the coming year. The other motivation for this is a little cheeky, but I'm dead serious when I say this, is next time a friend or family member who is skeptical of your attendance at the least churchy church in the United States, or at least in the Charlotte area, and wants to challenge the credentials, you can tell them that we're taking an entire year going through a book of the Bible. So something only people like John MacArthur would do. So we're 15 years, but we're not going to. It's probably going to take us, I've kind of mapped it out, probably going to take us into about this time next year. And we'll wrap things up. So that'll be super exciting. So anyway, let's dive in. So this book in general, and it's going to be confusing because I'm going to say this book, and you're never going to know whether I'm referring to this book, which is about a book about a book, or the book itself. So just assume it's both. This book, these books, on some level, they're all kind of about authority. And I think that's relevant. Matt said this a moment ago in reference to the book by Joshua Scott, who wrote the book that we're going to be using for the block experiences in the coming weeks. Yes, we're going to be looking at a very old story, a very old text that certainly had relevance, that was in some ways unique to the people who experienced it in its context. But I think the real reason for us to explore something like this is not only so we can understand what it meant to them back then, but so that we can sort of translate that, not just from Greek to English, which would have been or Aramaic for some of this, to our context, but there's a little bit more to the translation process when it comes to the Bible, because it's not just an ancient language that was being used. There's an ancient world picture, a conceptuality, a way of not just thinking, but of existing in the world, which is so fundamentally different from ours today. So when people tell you like, oh, I just care about the plain text of Scripture, they might be well-intentioned. They have no idea what they're talking about. There is no plain text of Scripture. Not only has the biblical document that we have, I keep pointing to this isn't the Bible, but the biblical document that we have, not only has it gone through years and years of translation and redaction and like the way that we actually got to the document that we have today, which is in itself a contested document, okay? So there are different traditions that call themselves Christian that use a different version of the Bible than maybe the one that you grew up with. Some of them have more books, some of them have less. Some of them make radically different translation decisions. I mean, even the translation process is not neutral. It's an interpretation process. Decisions are made to emphasize or prioritize or de-emphasize and deprioritize certain features of the text. And then there's certain things that we just are guessing on. Because, like I said, the world of Scripture is so fundamentally different than the world we occupy today. And so we are doing our best to sort of make an analogy, as best we can to sort of bridge that sort of conceptual gap that exists between that time and our own. And so this book and the book of the Bible that it is about are attempting to do that constructively, not just say, what did it mean for them back then, which is what we call biblical theology or biblical studies, but what might it mean for us today, which is what we might call constructive theology. So it's doing both, okay? And in the context back then, just as today, there were questions of authority that needed to be answered. I promised that we were only going to look at one verse today. That verse is Mark 1:1, which this is going to be confusing, but this is kind of the point of today, is to make this less confusing. This verse is the title of the book, okay? Or the title of the gospel. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Mark 1:1. That is actually the real title of this text that we call the Gospel of Mark. The Mark title was added later, potentially much later, at least maybe 100 years later. And that's kind of where I want to start, because the reason that it was given the title, the Gospel according to Mark, or just Mark, was in order to make a claim towards a certain kind of authority that within the context of this happening made some sense. It was defensible, but I want to suggest to you actually undermines the very promise that this text has in its attempt to really unsettle and make unstable all authority structures, okay? So this is one of those like rhetorical, like you don't have to actually raise your hand. We're never gonna ask you to raise your hand here. That might be traumatic for people who grew up in a different church context, but you can sort of mentally raise your hand if you grew up hearing perhaps that the mark in the title, which isn't actually in the title, the mark in the bestowed title of this book was someone named John Mark, who shows up in the book of Acts as one of Paul's companions. Paul, at some point, gets very annoyed with this fellow because of his immaturity and sends him off, I think, with Barnabas, who is Joseph, who, in a completely different context, I don't even know why I'm bothering saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I started. I have the fun sort of fan fiction level conspiracy theory about the identity of Barnabas that I would love to share with you at a later date. So maybe when we get through this, we'll do the book of John, which is a huge hint as to who I think the identity of Barnabas is. And everyone's intrigued. Now you're not going to listen to what I'm actually saying today, but dug my own grave there. Where was I? Oh yeah, John Mark. The reason that John Mark was sort of clinged to as the alleged author of this book is because a through line was drawn between John Mark and Peter. And attaching it to Peter would give it something called apostolic authority. So if it was tied to one of Jesus' apostles, the 12, or really 11, because there was that one guy, who they did replace. Not many people know that story. But anyway, if they were able to tie it to Peter, one of the other apostles, then that would give it authority. It would be an authoritative text that could then be used to like make rules and order and direct people to do certain things, and sort of it would add credibility to their claim on the gospel. And even that detail sort of glosses over something that many of us often miss. I certainly wasn't taught this growing up, but the simple fact that they needed to assign it a certain level of authority implies that from the very beginning, that authority was contested. You see, many of us are told that the Bible from its inception is this magical, harmonious, like ancient text message from God that comes down and what's the acronym? Basic instructions before leaving Earth. Anyone know that Burlap to Cashmere song? Yeah, saw them in concert once. Mediocre. But no, they're probably great guys. I don't know them at all. So that was an unnecessary pot shot. I apologize. But yeah, that's so I grew up with that notion of the Bible, that it was this manual, this like user's guide to how to be human. And I don't know about you, but I was like, really? This is exceedingly boring. 80% of the time at least, makes no sense. And honestly, like, I don't know if the word contradiction is right, but like, okay, I'll put it this way. This is a very niche example that is probably meaningful to me and like 6 other people, but I'm gonna run with it, which is like, in the world of manga and anime adaptation, oftentimes the anime, which is the television show version, catches up to the manga, which is the comic book show version. And so in order to give the author time to like write more, they create filler episodes, which are not part of the main plot and often kind of stupid, kind of silly and stuff like that. And so that's why, a very famous title like One Piece has like 20 years worth of content. So I kind of feel like that happened with the Bible. Like there's a lot of filler that doesn't seem to matter to us. It might be interesting, especially for people who want to be professional academics, but, devotionally, for example, okay? However, once I began to understand much later in life that that's not how the Bible works. And, I was sort of given permission, the freedom to understand the Bible as sort of the theater which people play out their wrestling with the divine. And so inevitably, almost by necessity, it reflects the cultural nuances of their day, the contradictions and the challenges and the assumptions and the insecurities that they face, that we face when we wrestle with our own experience of God. They also experience that. And so it creates almost a sort of deeply human continuity between their plight and ours. And it doesn't mean that their situation or the way that they even responded to their situation maps onto our world at like a one-to-one kind of perfectly synonymous level. But there is a way to kind of see that shared humanity, that common humanity. And even though their context was different, sort of the sort of the existential underpinnings of what they were going through are true for us today. And so when we're talking about this question of authority and wrestling with authority, I mean, I don't want to be overly specific here just for time, but I think almost every person in this room who has an internet connection, which I think is most of you, could probably think of 2 or 3 instances where the question of authority, who gets to decide and why, what is grounding those decisions, who is benefiting, and who is being exploited in order for those other folks to benefit. Those are questions that were being asked in this time, and they're questions I think that we're wrestling with today. So right off the bat, there is an internal tension, an internal debate within this text between where is the authority grounded. And I'm going to argue that in the original text, in the text itself, before however long later, it was given a somewhat arbitrary title in order to ground its authority elsewhere, that the anonymity of the text was quite intentional. Here's a few things that Ted Jennings himself says towards this. It says that What does it mean? So for example, if you've ever read the book of Mark in particular, and I'm just going to assume that a few of you have, it's the shortest of the Gospels, so it's probably the one that many of you were sort of given as like your starter text as you were kind of faking it till you made it with scripture reading. It's like, I'll start with Mark. It's short. You can read it in a sitting. It's 16 chapters, and they're short. And many of you were probably maybe told that it was written kind of like an action movie, like it's just like short sentences, like boom, boom, boom. It's like quick transitions, almost like comic book style. Hence the font that I use for the main graphic here. Probably the worst design graphic, by the way, that we have because I did it. Normally we outsource those. I did this one. So anyway, so for example, though, the book of Mark sheds Peter, the apostle who allegedly, like tradition, would have us believe that, this is meant to be somewhat Peter's gospel that like Mark wrote down on his behalf. If so, Peter is the most self-deprecating person in the history of famous people. Like this text is so anti-Peter that it's almost, it's like, like maybe he was doing like a Bruce Wayne Batman thing where he's trying to like create two identities that were like so like seemingly opposed to each other so that no one would know. I don't know. I mean, we can speculate, but almost certainly it's not meant to be attributed to him because it's so negative. Jennings says, what does it mean to attribute the authority of Peter to a text which reveals Peter only in a negative light, of one who never understands? Peter never understands, whose own theology is denounced by Jesus as satanic, and whose discipleship shatters upon the rock of threefold denial. I mean, that's way better than anything I would have written. The author has chosen anonymity rather than claiming any such authority. In fact, the text itself insists upon the importance of anonymity. Those who come to know or guess Jesus' identity are told by Jesus himself in this text to be silent. And the characters who are closest to Jesus, who most identify with him and his message, the ones who Jesus either identifies or in the course of the narrative most identify with Jesus, are themselves anonymous. There's the woman at Bethany who anoints his feet, the young man. You might not even, this woman is pretty famous, but these other two examples, you might not even realize. There's a young man who's taken prisoner with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Doesn't name who it is. And then there's this youth, this lad who's in the tomb on the resurrection. Tradition would have this person be an angel, but that's never stated anywhere. It's just, they get to the tomb and there's this teenager sitting there. And he's just like, he's gone. He went to Galilee, you should go there. Roll credits, that's how it ends. Anonymity is key, and this is why. By attempting to give this text kind of the image of authority, we do violence to the text itself, which claims no authority, whose author disclaims even the authority of a name. The anonymity is a feature, not a bug here, and I think it's instructive for us. Here's a quote. This one will be on the screen. This is sort of the thesis statement. For the message of this gospel is this, that only by turning against one's own self-interest, one's desire for self-preservation, one's attempts at self-assertion, can one begin to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus. So the message was at the same time, and for the same reason, a menace to every attempt to stabilize this community in terms of apostolic authority, religious tradition, political compromise. So we do this today, right? This is a massive debate, at least in some of the circles that I walk in, of like, who gets to be a Christian? Who's a Christian? Many of you in this room, I know for a fact, have been told by people close to you that you are not a Christian. In part because you go here. But maybe you ended up here because someone told you you weren't a Christian, you didn't really fit where you were before, so you wandered in the wilderness for a little bit, and then you found the promised land. Welcome. But I know you've thought the same thing about them. Many of you have looked at some of the ways that they live or they vote, and you've thought that's not the way of Jesus, and they've got their proof texts, we've got ours, and it's this debate over a label. And I don't want to completely trivialize that. I think words matter. I think these labels matter, but there is a desire to secure ourselves over and against those who oppose us. And so even if the content, even if the content is better than what we left behind in Cards on the Table, I think it is. I think we got better content. It's more just, it's more generous, it's more inclusive, and oftentimes it takes the same binary form that it took before. Either or, in, out, right, wrong. Our certainty is better than yours. Our proof texts trump, pun intended, yours. And at least one of the, if not the primary kind of takeaways of this gospel, this exploration, is that no, true liberation, true solidarity, true equality is found not with a true and better authority, but with the undermining of all authority. That real freedom is going to be found in the just undoing of authority as such. And that there's an invitation to a kind of radical unknowing, a kind of radical instability. And it's only in that sort of collective instability that we can truly be with and for one another. When the pretexts of authority are brought down, that's when we're free to be with and for. Before even one another, with and for ourselves. Because there's a certain degree to which we even create these buffers over and against our own authenticity, and that we try to ground those buffers in a kind of authority in order to maybe avoid facing the parts of ourselves that we deem or have been deemed for us to be less than. And so there's before we even get to the freedom to be with and for one another, we sort of have to embrace a kind of freedom, a kind of overcoming of a certain fear to be with and for ourselves. And so I think the anonymity of this gospel speaks to that as well. What else? This is fun, right? This is one verse. Take that, John MacArthur. A few other things to note. This is an aside. It doesn't really fit with where I'm going, but it doesn't not fit, and I think it's worth naming. So Jennings does this. We talked about this with Shay when he was here a month ago, but Jennings very intentionally chooses, even though just for convenience's sake, he refers to the author as Mark, even though it almost certainly wasn't someone named Mark. Maybe it was his innie, sorry. Jennings uses female pronouns, she, her pronouns, to sort of juxtapose, to sort of illustrate the undermining of authority. And that works on a few levels, I think most of which are obvious. This is a text born out of Mark was a text born out of a very patriarchal society, a very patriarchal world. And so sort of by provocatively, subversively using female pronouns, it sort of illustrates sort of a subversive undermining of those authority structures. But even beyond that, and we know this on some level historically, Jesus' ministry was massively fueled by wealthy women. Jesus' own posture towards women was a little countercultural. And despite his reputation, Paul's was as well, in a good way. Some of the worst instances of Pauline misogyny were probably not written by Paul. And if they were, kind of screw him, but whatever. But the point is, I think there's something meaningful about this gesture that Jennings makes with the text, even though the reality is that this text, Mark, was probably more communally written. Probably didn't have a single author. It was probably something that emerged over time through this particular community that was trying to make sense of its existence in light of an encounter with Jesus and everything that was going on around them. It's interesting to note that none of these texts call itself a gospel. Technically, there's only one gospel from a Christian perspective, which means good news, the proclamation concerning God's coming, God's love, God's grace, which is somehow made manifest in Jesus. The gospel is not a narrative, but a proclamation. The Greek word there is kerygma. And that's important because I think oftentimes we try to reduce the gospel to its cultural expression. All right. The cultural expression historically was the life, death, and resurrection of this person, Jesus of Nazareth. But even in our own time, the version of the gospel that you were probably presented, which probably involved some degree of your wretchedness, some degree of God's holiness, some amount of Jesus's blood, and some pithy prayer that you prayed at summer camp, usually on a Tuesday. That was typically decision night, at least in the youth ministry circles that I ran in. But anyway, the gospel, even in that sense, is being translated. It's being reduced into a certain cultural form. But the idea here is that whatever the gospel is, it's something that is before, above, ahead of language, of culture. It transcends, it's naming something that's fundamentally true, maybe about reality. And we're sort of accommodating our own contextual finitude by applying cultural clothes to it. I don't know if that's a good or helpful analogy, but it's this idea that whatever the gospel is, it transcends culture. And so it has to be translated. It has to be contextualized in a new, fresh way, almost in every moment, but at least in every different subsequent historical epoch. It's why even with good intentions, so much of Christian mission over the course of history has been colonialistic and imperialistic. Oftentimes it wasn't with good intention. Oftentimes it was with economic intention, which was intentionally exploitive. But sometimes, if I'm being generous, it really was sincere, but there was this sense in which the gospel is untranslatable. And so the only way for these folks to be saved or to be brought into the fold is to adopt not just our beliefs, but our customs, our culture, our practices. And so it was necessarily colonialistic or imperialistic. But I think it's a much more redemptive approach to understanding the gospel to say that no, it is not bound culturally. It cannot be reduced to a cultural expression. This is all provisional. We're pointing at something that is out above and ahead of us, and we're just sort of doing our best. If you're familiar with the Exodus narrative, not necessarily just the book of Exodus, because there's more of it in Numbers and stuff like that. I'm going to out myself as a terrible pastor and Bible scholar right here. I don't remember if what I'm about to talk about is in Exodus or Numbers or both, but or Deuteronomy. So many options. But there's the instance where Moses, and I know that there's different accounts of this, where Moses is up on Mount Sinai talking to God, and he says something to the effect of, and I am brutally paraphrasing here, I want to see your face. And God says, again, to paraphrase, you can't, it'll kill you. But you can see where I've been. You can see me pass by. You can see my backside or my footprints or something like that. And I think that's illustrative here. We're talking about something that doesn't fit cleanly into human conceptuality, but we can see its after effects. We can see where it's been. Jesus himself is even alluding to this in John chapter 3 when he's talking to Nicodemus, and he's talking about being born of water and of the Spirit, and he compares it to the wind, and you don't know where the wind is going, but you can see its effects. The gospel is a proclamation at that level. And we're just sort of doing our best to make sense of it in our conceptuality. So inevitably, we're going to be flying blind a little bit, and we're going to be sort of playing catch up, trying to, it's like this, but not exactly like that. It's like this. That's even a little bit. It's where we get the concept of denomination. We've talked about this here, I think, before. To nominate something is to name it, and to name it is necessarily to limit it, but to limit it is actually to invite it to transcend those limits, which then creates a denomination. It's like this, but it's not exactly like that. You limited it, it transcended those limits, so you qualified, which then gives you the opportunity to nominate it again. And then this process continues endlessly, and so you end up at Watershed. Next time you want to be provocative amongst, someone's like, oh, are you part of that deconstruction movement? No. We're part of that nomination and denomination movement. And then hopefully then you start talking about sports or something. We'll see. What else? So another thing that I think is important to name here, is, this is a bit of an origin story, all right? I love origin stories. I like prequels. If you know me at all, this fits all of your stereotypes and assumptions about me. But sometimes we like an origin story because it I think sometimes maybe that's the most relatable part. I think there's something telling also about the fact that, how many of you are familiar with, with like a throwaway phrase, like, you're going through something like, this is going to be my villain origin story. I've said that. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. But the basic, I'm going to explain the meme now. The basic premise is that you're going through something, and the idea is, and I think it's sort of a redemptive idea, is that if someone's doing something bad, they probably didn't start that way. And I think this is actually really important to keep in mind, because there's probably people who you can imagine in the world, if not your immediate life, but certainly in the world, who are doing things that you think are very, very bad right now. And I would agree with you. And the temptation is to dehumanize them and be like, they are just evil incarnate. They probably have an origin story. And understanding that origin story isn't necessarily going to magically fix things, but it helps. And so in many ways, this is not the gospel, it's the gospel's origin story. And I think it's important that it's an origin story of anonymity. It's an origin story that seeks to undermine all claims or grasps at authority. And with that in mind, I think this one will be on the screen. Jennings says that this is a message that is not about the past, but it's about the present and the relationship of that present to the future. So even when it was being written, the events that are being recounted when it was written had already happened. But the purpose of this gospel being written was not to simply tell them what happened in the past. The assumption actually is that they already knew that they were already part of this thing called the church that was emerging 2,000 years ago. So it was not so much to tell them something that they didn't know, but it was to reframe something that they thought they already knew in a different light, to sort of reclaim or sort of reshape something so that they would affect them in the present and reshape the way that they postured themselves towards the future. And so in that sense, even though we're 2,000 years in a massive sort of cultural gap distanced from them, it sort of serves the same purpose for us today. Jennings continues, when we have finished the narrative, we will not come to the end of the gospel, but rather the end of a consideration of its beginning. And I think, a year and a half from now, or whenever we finally get done with this, in many ways we'll have done the same. And who knows what the world is going to look like then. And I don't hopefully say that morbidly or cryptically. And I alluded to this a moment ago, and band, this can be your cue, I guess. I missed the meeting. I didn't tell them when they were going to come up, so I just said I would make it explicit. But in many ways, the Gospel of Mark, as with much of the New Testament, was written to and sometimes against the church. And so in certain ways, you might even find yourself here today feeling as if you are also in some ways postured against the church. I mean, we even hesitate sometimes to call this place a church. I mean, if I'm being completely honest, it definitely is. But when we're wrestling with like when someone says, what do you do for a living? I'm like, nonprofit work. But maybe you have wondered how to answer the question. People are like, oh, do you go to church somewhere? Where do you go to church? And you're kind of like, oh, it's hard to explain. Or you're kind of feeling out the conversation. Oh, is this someone who's going to be excited about this? Or is this going to make the rest of this meal uncomfortable? You don't know. But here's the thing. From the very beginning, this was true. There has never at any point in human or Christian history been a monolithic expression of Christianity or any other faith. There's only ever been a plurality. There's only ever been Christianities. There's only ever been an encounter with something that transcends or exceeds human cultural expression or language, and individual and collective attempts to make sense of that. That's true of Judaism, that's true of Islam, that's true of Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous religions, that's true of Christianity. There are better and worse expressions, at least in my opinion, but we're all wrestling with a transcendent encounter that's beyond us and trying to make sense of it in the most just and generous way that we can. All right, and so in many ways, the book of Mark, in many ways, our very existence it's against the church, not because being part of a community, not because of being part of a collective is bad. In fact, I think it's necessary. I think it's inevitable, even when we try to shun it. But it's against the church insofar as, even with good intention, the church often ends up being sort of a institutionalization or a formalization of these grasping attempts that we make. And again, even with good intention, when we concretize these things into something that can be measured in doctrines and certainties, then we're not too far off from those being weaponized and lorded against those who disagree with us. And it doesn't matter, even if I think, and I genuinely do think, that we have a better expression, a better way, more inclusive, more equitable, full of solidarity, more loving. The moment that we kind of eternalize those as true for all times and all places and then impose them, again, even with good intention, on first ourselves and then others, we're risking adopting that same exploitive and oppressive form of the people that we're trying to distance ourselves from. And so in undermining authority, in embracing a kind of anonymity, we're leveling the playing field, we're clearing the stage, we're setting the table, whatever metaphor you want to use, but we're inviting everyone into maybe the only universality, the only collectivity which we truly have, which is one of instability, one of uncertainty. But we can answer instability with solidarity, and we can answer uncertainty with curiosity. So that's the invitation. And right, wrong, or otherwise, we're going to have to wait till, actually, I just realized this. I realized this earlier. The next time I get to do this, wait for it, May 4th. And this is, Cedric has gotten to speak on May 4th before. I have not, so I'm pretty excited about this. So, so we will see how that goes. I'm really excited about it. I hope you are too. I didn't really have like a way to land the plane other than that, so I'm just gonna leave you with that anticipation. Thanks for being here. The band's gonna be awesome. Live long and prosper. See ya.